You know what finally made me mad enough to dig into this? I was building a small rowing skiff in my shop a few years back, using marine plywood, epoxy, stainless steel fasteners, everything the modern books tell you to use. And within 2 seasons, I had cracks forming along the chines, fasteners working loose, and a hull that was fighting the water every time I took it out. Then, I started reading about the Viking longships, ships that crossed the North Atlantic in open ocean, in storms that would terrify a modern sailor, built by people who had no epoxy, no plywood, no stainless steel, and no power tools. And those ships survived. Some of them survived for over 1,000 years. The techniques they used were so effective that they almost look like magic, until you understand the engineering behind them, and then they look like pure genius. Today, I am going to walk you through 10 of those techniques, methods that got abandoned the moment industry found something faster and cheaper. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you a marking trick I learned from a Scandinavian boat builder that changed how I read a log before I ever pick up a tool. Let me show you what these shipwrights figured out. What we are really talking about here is 1,000 years of open ocean engineering developed by people who paid for their mistakes with their lives. These were not hobbyists. These were not academics. If a joint failed at sea, men drowned. That kind of pressure produces craftsmanship that is ruthlessly practical, and once you see the thinking behind it, you start to realize we lost something real when we traded it all for speed. So let me give you some context because I think this is important. The Viking Age runs roughly from the late 700s to the mid-1000s, and during that stretch, Scandinavian shipwrights built some of the most remarkable wooden vessels in human history. We know this because several of those ships survived. The Gokstad ship, pulled from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, is over 76 feet long and was built around 890. The Oseberg ship, excavated in 1904, dates to around 820. These are not reconstructions or guesses. These are actual ships you can go see in a museum. And when you stand next to one, the first thing that hits you is how thin and light everything is. The planking on the Gokstad ship is just 1 inch thick in most places, 1 inch of oak between the crew and the North Atlantic. And it worked. It worked because every single construction decision was driven by one principle. The ship must move with the sea, not against it. A rigid ship fights the waves, and the waves always win. A flexible ship absorbs the energy, redistributes it, and keeps sailing. That is the thread that runs through every technique I'm about to show you. They were not building structures, they were building living things. The first trick is how they got their planks. Most of us today walk into a lumber yard and buy boards that were flat sawn on a bandsaw. The Vikings never sawed anything. They took a single oak log, sometimes 3 feet in diameter, and split it radially using iron wedges and wooden mallets. They would start by halving the log, then quartering it, then splitting each quarter into thinner and thinner wedges until they had as many as 12 planks from one log. Every single plank followed the grain perfectly from end to end because the wood split along its own natural fiber lines. No grain run out, no weak spots, no cross-grain failures. When you flat saw a board on a bandsaw, the blade cuts across the grain at various angles, and that is where your weakness lives. A split plank is stronger, inch for inch, than a sawn plank of the same species. They figured that out 1,000 years before we had the science to explain why. And they did it with a wedge, a mallet, and patience. The second technique is the one that really changed how I think about boat building. They deliberately designed their hulls to flex. The Gokstad ship, at over 76 feet long, can twist and rack several inches from side to side. That is not a flaw. That is the design. When a wave hits a rigid hull, all that energy has to go somewhere, and it goes into the fasteners, the joints, and eventually into cracks. But when a wave hits a flexible hull, the entire structure absorbs the energy by bending, twisting slightly, and then returning to shape. It is the same principle behind why a willow tree survives a storm that snaps an oak. Modern boats are built stiff with fiberglass, epoxy, and through-bolted frames. They resist the water. Viking ships danced with it, and they could do this because of how every other element of the construction was designed to allow controlled movement. Nothing was locked rigid. Everything had a little bit of give. By the way, If you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third technique is how they made that 1-inch thick plank survive an ocean crossing. It comes back to the splitting. Because every plank was riven along the grain, the full length of the wood fibers ran unbroken from bow to stern. That means a 1-inch thick riven oak plank has tensile strength that a 2-inch sawn plank cannot match. On top of that, they shaped each plank with a gentle curve, thinning it toward the edges where it would overlap with the next plank. This meant the hull was not just a collection of flat boards nailed together. It was a continuous curved shell, where each plank contributed to the overall strength. 1 inch of riven oak, shaped by hand, following the natural curve of the tree, was enough to cross an ocean, and it did, over and over again, for 300 years. Now, the fourth technique ties directly into that flexible hull idea. Instead of bolting the internal ribs tightly to the planking the way modern builders do, Viking shipwrights lashed them in place using spruce root or flexible withies. The ribs sat in natural alignment with the hull shape, but they were not locked down. They could shift slightly, rotate a few degrees, absorb shock independently. Think of it like a skeleton inside a body. Your ribs are not welded to your spine. They have cartilage. They flex. They move when you breathe. That is exactly what the Viking shipwrights were doing. The frame supports the hull, but it does not constrain it. When I first learned this, I went back and looked at my skiff and realized I had bolted everything so tightly that the hull had nowhere to move except into failure. The Vikings gave their boats room to breathe. The fifth method is one that takes real patience and foresight. For the curved structural members, the stems, the knees, the ribs, they did not steam bend straight timber the way we do. They went into the forest and selected trees that had already grown into the shape they needed. A branch junction that formed a natural 90-degree angle became a knee. A trunk that curved from growing on a hillside became a stem piece. The grain follows the curve naturally, which means the strength follows the curve. When you steam bend a straight piece of oak into a curve, the outer fibers are in tension and the inner fibers are in compression, and over time, that stress can cause the piece to crack or spring back. A naturally grown curve has none of that internal stress. The wood grew that way. It wants to be that shape. The Vikings planned for this. They managed woodlands specifically to produce curved timber. That is not primitive. That is agricultural engineering in service of shipbuilding. The sixth technique is clinker construction, and once you understand it, you will see it everywhere. Instead of butting planks edge to edge the way a smooth-hulled carvel ship is built, Viking ships overlap each plank over the one below it, like shingles on a roof. Each overlap is fastened with iron rivets, and the lower edge of each plank sheds water outward and downward. Water runs off a clinker hull, the same way rain runs off a shingled roof. It cannot work its way upward into the seam because gravity and the overlap angle are always pushing it away. On top of that, the overlapping planks create a series of small ridges along the outside of the hull, and those ridges actually help with hydrodynamics. They channel water flow along the hull in a way that reduces drag at certain speeds. Modern naval architects have studied this and confirmed it. 1,000 years before computational fluid dynamics, the Vikings stumbled onto a hull shape that is measurably efficient. The seventh technique is their caulking method, and it is beautifully simple. They took raw wool, soaked it in pine tar, and laid it into the overlap seams between planks before riveting them together. When the hull flexes and the seams open slightly, seawater touches the tarred wool. The wool fibers swell when wet, the tar remains waterproof, and the seam seals itself tighter than it was when it was dry. Every time the hull works in a seaway, every time a seam opens and closes, the caulking reseats itself. Compare that to modern caulking compounds that cure rigid and then crack when the hull moves. The Viking solution was self-healing. It got better with use, not worse, and all it took was wool and pine tar. Trick number 8 is one that shocks most modern woodworkers. The primary shaping tool for an entire ocean-going vessel was a broad axe. Not a saw, not a plane, not a router. An axe. Specifically, a side-beveled broad axe with a flat face on one side and a beveled cutting edge on the other. In the hands of a skilled shipwright, this tool can produce a surface that is smoother than what most people get with a jackplane. I have watched Scandinavian boat builders who still practice traditional methods hew a plank to finished thickness with a broad axe, and the surface quality is remarkable. The axe was faster than a saw for the work they were doing. It followed the grain naturally because the wood told the tool where to go. And because they were working split timber that already had clean grain lines, the axe simply refined what the wedge had started. The 9th technique is tree nails, and I love this one for its simplicity. Where iron rivets were not used, the Vikings fastened structural members with wooden pegs, usually made from a denser or different species than the surrounding timber. A dry oak tree nail, driven into a slightly undersized hole, will absorb moisture from the surrounding green timber and from seawater exposure, and as it absorbs that moisture, it swells. As it swells, it locks itself into the hole with a friction fit that gets tighter over time. No glue, no threads, no mechanical fastener. Just the physics of wood and water doing exactly what they naturally do. Some of the tree nails in excavated Viking ships are still locked tight after 1,000 years. Try finding a stainless steel screw that performs that well. The 10th technique, and the one that ties everything together, is how they read a standing tree. Before a single cut was made, a master shipwright would walk through the forest and evaluate living trees for the planks hidden inside them. They looked at the bark spiral to predict grain direction. They looked at branch patterns to estimate how clean the lower trunk would split. They checked the taper, the lean, and the soil conditions. A tree growing on a north-facing slope in well-drained soil produces tighter, more uniform grain than the same species on a south-facing slope with heavy clay. They knew this. They selected their timber the way a sculptor selects marble, seeing the finished work inside the raw material before any shaping begins. By the time the tree hit the ground, the shipwright already knew how many planks it would yield, what part of the hull each one was destined for, and which face would go outward. That is not guessing. That is 1,000 years of accumulated observation, passed down generation to generation. Let me share some patterns I have noticed that most of us follow by default, things I did myself for years, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for a saw to break down lumber. We do it because it is fast and because every shop has a table saw or a bandsaw. But every saw cut crosses grain fibers. The Vikings avoided this entirely by splitting, and the result was planks that were fundamentally stronger. I am not saying to throw away your table saw, but for structural or high-stress components, riving with wedges along the grain produces a better board, and it is something any of us can do with a few steel wedges and a sledge. The second pattern is building everything rigid. We glue, we bolt, we epoxy, we laminate, and we create assemblies that have zero tolerance for movement. Then we act surprised when things crack. The Viking approach of allowing controlled flex is something that applies way beyond boat building. If you have ever had a tabletop split because it was screwed too tightly to the aprons, you have experienced exactly the failure mode that Viking shipwrights designed around 1,000 years ago. The third pattern is relying on hardware store fasteners for everything. Screws strip, nails pull out, bolts require through holes that weaken the timber. Tree nails are free, they require no trip to the store, and they actually get stronger over time. I have started using hardwood pegs in my joinery wherever I can, and the results have been excellent. The fourth pattern is choosing lumber by appearance, rather than by grain structure. We pick boards that look good and are the right thickness, without thinking about how the grain was oriented when that board was cut from the log. The Vikings selected every piece of timber based on how the grain would perform in service. Once you start thinking that way, your projects get stronger and more stable, even if they look exactly the same from the outside. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I picked up from a traditional Scandinavian boat builder, and I have never seen it in any mainstream woodworking book. When he selects a log for splitting, before he drives the first wedge, He cuts a small cookie off the end, maybe 2 inches thick. Then he counts the rings per inch on all 4 quadrants of that cookie: north, south, east, west. If the ring count is uniform all the way around, the log will split cleanly and yield symmetrical planks. If one side has noticeably tighter rings than the other, the log grew under uneven stress, maybe from wind or slope, or a neighboring tree crowding it. That log will split unevenly, and the planks from the tight side will behave differently from the planks on the wide side. He showed me this with 2 logs sitting side by side. One had even ring spacing, and it split into beautiful, uniform planks. The other had a 2-to-1 difference in ring density from one side to the other, and when he split it, the planks came out tapered and twisted. 2 minutes of reading the end grain saved him hours of fighting bad material. I use this now every time I buy a log, or even when I am picking through rough lumber at the yard. Check the end grain, count the rings. Let the wood tell you what it wants to do before you ever ask it to do anything. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 16 chapters of techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what Secrets of the Shipyard is. It is my collection of Viking and naval carpentry secrets from the world's greatest traditional shipwrights, all in one place, with 25 hand-drawn illustrations and 150 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.